The morning sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Harold Thompson carefully buttoned up his favorite plaid shirt. At 93 years old, his fingers weren't as nimble as they used to be, but he took pride in dressing himself every morning without help. He stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the Navy veteran cap that had been his constant companion for decades. The blue fabric was faded, and the golden anchor emblem had lost some of its shine, but to Harold, it was more precious than any crown. Living alone in his small house on Maple Street wasn't always easy, but Harold had developed a routine that kept him going. His neighborhood, Millbrook, was a quiet town where everyone knew each other. The kind of place where people still said good morning to strangers and children played freely in their front yards. Every morning, without fail, Harold would begin his 3-block journey to Pete's Diner at exactly 7:15 a.m. He moved slowly, using his wooden cane for support, but he never complained about the walk. The exercise, he would tell anyone who offered him a ride, kept him young at heart. The familiar bell above Pete's Diner door would chime as Harold pushed it open at precisely 7:30 a.m. morning. Mr. Thompson. Sarah, the young waitress with bright red hair and a kinder smile, would call out. She already had his regular coffee cup ready, black with just a hint of sugar, served in the blue mug he'd been using for the past 15 years. "Table 7 is waiting for you, sir," Sarah would say, even though everyone knew Harold wouldn't sit anywhere else. Table 7 had the perfect view of both the street and the kitchen, and the morning sun wouldn't get in his eyes. More importantly, it was the table where he could easily share his stories with anyone willing to listen. The other regular customers at Pete's had grown used to Harold's presence. There was Bob the mailman, who always stopped by for a quick breakfast before starting his route. Mary, the elementary school teacher, would come in early to grade papers while enjoying her morning pancakes. And then there were the high school students who would drop by for coffee before classes, always showing respect to the old veteran. What made Harold special wasn't just his age or his veteran status. It was the way he connected with people. When children would point at his cap and ask questions, he'd share stories about his time in the Navy, carefully choosing tales that would inspire rather than frighten. He would tell them about the importance of friendship, loyalty, and standing up for what's right. "You see this cap?" he would often say to the young ones, touching the worn brim gently. "It represents not just me, but all the brave men and women who served our country. Some of them never came back home, and that's why we must remember them." Pete, the diner's owner, had known Harold for over 2 decades. Every morning, he would emerge from his kitchen to share a few words with the old veteran. "Mr. Thompson," Pete would say, "you're as regular as my wall clock. I can set my watch by your arrival." Harold would always respond with the same gentle smile and say, "When you've served in the military as long as I have, Pete, being on time becomes part of who you are." On this particular morning, everything seemed normal. Harold sat at his usual table, sipping his coffee and enjoying his daily breakfast of 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a small bowl of oatmeal with raisins. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, creating a peaceful atmosphere in the diner. Little did Harold know that this ordinary morning would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in his life. As he sat there, enjoying the familiar comfort of his daily routine, none of the diner's patrons could have guessed that their beloved veteran would soon face a challenge that would test not just his patience, but also reveal a side of him that nobody in Millbrook had ever seen. Sarah refilled his coffee cup one more time, and Harold thanked her with his usual politeness. Outside, the town was coming to life, and the peaceful scene gave no indication of the events that were about to unfold. Events that would change not only Harold's life, but the entire community of Millbrook forever. On a warm Tuesday morning, the peaceful atmosphere of Millbrook changed forever. The rumbling sound of motorcycle engines shattered the usual quiet of Main Street. Harold Thompson looked up from his coffee cup at Pete's Diner as 5 large motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The bikers were dressed in black leather jackets with a fierce-looking wolf logo on the back. Their leader, a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses, walked into the diner first. The bell above the door jingled nervously, as if even it sensed something was different today. Sarah, the waitress, nearly dropped her coffee pot when all 5 bikers squeezed into the booth next to Harold's regular table. Their loud voices and rough laughter filled the small diner, making other customers uncomfortable. Mrs. Jenkins, who usually enjoyed her morning crossword puzzle in peace, quickly paid her bill and left. "Hey, look at the old-timer with his fancy hat," one of the bikers said loudly, pointing at Harold's Navy veteran cap. Harold tried to ignore them, focusing instead on his breakfast, but their laughter grew louder. Pete emerged from his kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He could sense the tension in his diner. "Gentlemen," he said to the bikers, "welcome to Pete's. Can I get you something to eat?" The leader of the group, who called himself Wolf, ordered breakfast for everyone in a voice that seemed to dare anyone to object. "And make it quick," he added, unnecessarily loud. Over the next few days, more motorcycles began appearing in the parking lot. What started as 5 bikers turned into 10, then 15. They took over most of the parking spaces, making it difficult for regular customers to find a spot. Some of the older patrons stopped coming altogether, scared by the intimidating presence of the motorcycle gang. Harold, however, refused to change his routine. Every morning at 7:30, he would arrive for his breakfast, walking past the row of motorcycles with his head held high, but the bikers made things increasingly difficult for him. One morning, they purposely parked their bikes so close together that Harold couldn't squeeze through to reach the diner's entrance. He had to walk all the way around the building, using his cane for support in the uneven back alley. "Oh, look at Grandpa taking the scenic route," one of them mockingly called out, causing the others to laugh. Sarah tried her best to protect Harold. She would save his regular table and make sure his coffee was ready, but the bikers seemed to take special pleasure in disrupting his peaceful mornings. They would bump his table while walking past, making his coffee spill, or talk extra loudly when he was trying to share his war stories with other customers. Pete was worried. He had known Harold for years and couldn't bear to see him treated this way. But the bikers were bad for business in more ways than one. They scared away regular customers, but they also spent a lot of money. Pete felt trapped between wanting to protect his old friend and keeping his business alive. "Mr. Thompson," Pete said one morning, his voice full of concern, "maybe you could come a little earlier, before they arrive?" But Harold just smiled and shook his head. "Pete, my boy," he said quietly, "I faced worse things than a group of loud youngsters. This is my time, and this is my place." The situation got even more tense when the bikers discovered that Harold would sometimes tell stories about his military service to young customers. They started interrupting him, making fun of his age and his stories. "Hey Gramps, tell us about how you won World War II all by yourself," Wolf would say sarcastically, making his gang laugh. Harold remained calm through it all, but those who knew him well could see the sadness in his eyes. The diner that had been his morning sanctuary for so many years was becoming a place of stress and confrontation. What the bikers didn't realize was that beneath Harold's quiet exterior and gentle demeanor lay the heart and mind of a man who had faced far greater challenges in his life. As the harassment continued day after day, something was building inside the old veteran, not anger, but a plan that would soon surprise everyone in Millbrook. 3 weeks had passed since the bikers first arrived at Pete's Diner, and their behavior toward Harold Thompson was getting worse with each passing day. The morning started like any other, with Harold making his way to the diner, his wooden cane tapping softly against the sidewalk. But today would prove to be different from all the rest. As Harold approached the diner's entrance, he noticed his usual path was blocked by 3 motorcycles parked particularly close together. Wolf, the gang's leader, sat on one of the bikes, pretending to clean it. He looked up at Harold with a smirk that suggested he had been waiting for this moment. "Well, if it isn't the ancient warrior," Wolf called out, loud enough for his friends to hear. "Looks like you'll have to find another way around, old-timer." Harold began to carefully make his way around the motorcycles, but as he did, one of the younger bikers deliberately stuck out his foot. Harold, unable to see it in time, tripped. His cane went flying, and he would have fallen hard if Pete hadn't rushed out of the diner just in time to catch him. "That's enough," Pete shouted, his face red with anger. "You can't treat people this way." The bikers just laughed. Wolf picked up Harold's cane and twirled it like a baton. "Nice stick you got here, Gramps. Maybe you should donate it to a museum, along with yourself." Sarah, watching from inside the diner, had tears in her eyes. She had already called the police twice before about the bikers, but they always left before any officers arrived, only to return the next day even more aggressive. Inside the diner, things got worse. The bikers had claimed the tables around Harold's usual spot, surrounding him like wolves circling their prey. They took turns mocking his every move. When Harold tried to drink his coffee, they would bump his table, making the hot liquid spill onto his hands. "Oops, sorry, Grandpa," they would say, "not sorry at all. Getting a bit shaky in your old age, aren't you?" The final straw came when Harold reached up to adjust his beloved Navy veteran cap. One of the younger bikers, trying to impress his friends, snatched it right off Harold's head. "Let's see what's so special about this old hat," the young biker said, tossing it to his friends like it was a game. The cap, which Harold had worn with pride for decades, was thrown from one biker to another, each time just out of his reach. The precious military pins on it jingled with each toss. One pin, in particular, caught the light. A small gold star that Harold had received for an act of bravery that none of these young troublemakers could even imagine. Pete tried to intervene again, but Wolf stood up, his massive frame towering over the diner owner. "This is between us and the old man," he growled. "Stay out of it if you know what's good for your business." The other customers in the diner watched in helpless silence. Mrs. Jenkins was crying quietly in her corner booth. Bob the mailman had his fists clenched but knew he was outnumbered. Even the high school kids who usually loved hearing Harold's stories couldn't do anything to help. Finally, the cap landed in Wolf's hands. He looked at it with exaggerated interest, then held it up high. "Maybe it's time for this relic to retire, just like you should have years ago," he sneered at Harold. Harold stood up slowly, his blue eyes fixed on Wolf. For the first time since the bikers had arrived, something changed in the old veteran's expression. The usual gentle look was replaced by something else, a glimmer of the man he used to be, the warrior that still lived within him. "Young man," Harold said, his voice quiet but clear, "you have no idea who you're dealing with." The bikers laughed at what they thought was an empty threat from an old man, but they didn't notice Harold taking out his cell phone with steady hands. They didn't see him sending a brief text message. They had no way of knowing that this seemingly helpless 93-year-old veteran had just set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. As Harold walked out of the diner that morning, leaving his precious cap in Wolf's hands, he wasn't retreating. No, Harold Thompson was about to remind everyone in Millbrook why you should never underestimate a Navy veteran, no matter how old he might be. That evening, after the incident at Pete's Diner, Harold Thompson sat in his small home office, surrounded by old photographs and military documents that few people had ever seen. His hands moved slowly across a dusty wooden chest that hadn't been opened in years. With careful movements, he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, perfectly preserved, lay the evidence of a life that would have shocked everyone in Millbrook. Harold pulled out a black and white photograph showing a much younger version of himself, standing tall and strong in front of a group of tough-looking men. The words "Navy SEAL Training Command, Lead Instructor Thompson, 1960" were written on the back. Sarah, who had come to check on Harold after her shift, stood in the doorway with wide eyes. She had brought him some soup, worried that he hadn't eaten properly after leaving the diner that morning. Now she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Mr. Thompson," she gasped, looking at the medals and certificates spread across his desk. "You are a Navy SEAL instructor?" Harold nodded slowly, picking up a gold medal that gleamed even after all these years. "For 27 years, he said quietly, I trained some of the toughest men in the military. Over 800 SEALs learned their skills under my command." Sarah picked up another photograph, this one showing Harold demonstrating combat techniques to a group of soldiers. His face was serious, his body language showing strength and authority that seemed so different from the gentle old man she knew. "But why didn't you ever tell anyone?" she asked, sitting down in the old armchair next to his desk. Harold smiled softly. "There was never any need to brag," he explained. "After retiring, I wanted a quiet life. Those young fellows at the diner, they remind me of some of the cocky recruits I used to train. Full of themselves, thinking strength is all about muscles and loud voices." He pulled out more documents from the chest, training manuals he had written, certificates of appreciation from high-ranking military officers, and letters from former students who had gone on to become decorated war heroes. "You see this?" Harold held up a worn piece of paper. "This is a letter from Admiral Richardson. He was one of my students in 1965. Last I heard, he was helping run the entire Pacific Fleet." As Harold continued showing Sarah his past, the phone on his desk rang. It was Pete, calling to check on him. Harold put the phone on speaker. "Mr. Thompson," Pete's worried voice filled the room. "Those bikers were laughing about your cap all day. They'd hung it on their motorcycle like some kind of trophy. I tried to get it back, but they threatened to trash the diner. Harold's face remained calm, but his eyes showed a determination that Sarah had never seen before. "Don't worry about the cap, Pete," he said. "I've already made some calls." He reached for another photograph, this one more recent. It showed Harold at a military reunion 5 years ago, surrounded by dozens of men in uniform. These weren't just any soldiers. They were elite Navy SEALs, Marine commanders, and high-ranking officers, all of whom had trained under Harold during their careers. "Sarah," Harold said, turning to the young waitress, "would you like to know why I've kept all this hidden for so long?" She nodded, still amazed by everything she was learning about the quiet old man who had been coming to the diner for years. "Because true strength isn't about showing off or bullying others," he explained, his voice growing stronger. "It's about knowing when to use your power, and more importantly, when not to use it." Harold picked up his phone and looked at the text messages he had sent earlier that day. The responses were already coming in, dozens of them. His former students, now high-ranking military officers, were all replying with the same message. "We're coming, sir." "Those young men at the diner think they know something about brotherhood and respect," Harold said, a slight smile forming on his lips. "Tomorrow morning, they're going to learn what those words really mean." Sarah looked at the messages flooding Harold's phone, then at the photographs of the tough, skilled soldiers he had trained. She suddenly realized that tomorrow's breakfast at Pete's Diner was going to be very different from anything Millbrook had ever seen. The next morning arrived with an unusual fog covering Millbrook. Harold Thompson woke up earlier than usual, at 5:30 a.m. He stood in front of his mirror, not wearing his usual plaid shirt, but instead putting on a crisp blue uniform that still fit perfectly after all these years. On the chest of the uniform were rows of medals that told stories of bravery and service. His phone had been buzzing all night with messages. "ETA 700 hours, read one." "Coming in from Fort Bragg," said another. "Bringing the whole squad, sir," mentioned a third. Harold smiled as he read each message, knowing that his former students had not forgotten him. At 6:45 a.m., Harold heard the first helicopter, then another and another. The sound of military vehicles approaching town broke the morning silence. Black SUVs with government plates began parking quietly around Pete's Diner. Men in uniform emerged from these vehicles, moving with the disciplined precision that Harold had taught them years ago. Meanwhile, the bikers were already at the diner, having arrived early to claim their usual spots. Wolf had Harold's navy cap hanging from his motorcycle's handlebar like a trophy. The gang was laughing and joking, not paying attention to the gathering force around them. Sarah arrived for her morning shift and gasped when she saw the scene unfolding. Dozens of military vehicles were parked strategically around the diner. She recognized several high-ranking officers from the photographs Harold had shown her the night before. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Harold began his walk to the diner. But this time he wasn't alone. As he turned the corner onto Main Street, two lines of Navy SEALs in full-dress uniform formed behind him. Among them were commanders, captains, and even an admiral. Each step they took was perfectly synchronized, their shoes clicking against the pavement in unison. The bikers inside the diner began to notice something was different. The regular customers, who had arrived early to witness what was about to happen, sat quietly with knowing smiles. Pete stood in his doorway, watching with pride as Harold approached. Wolf and his gang stepped outside, curious about the commotion. Their faces showed confusion as they saw Harold approaching in his decorated uniform, followed by what looked like an entire military command. "What's all this supposed to be?" Wolf asked, trying to sound tough but his voice cracking slightly. Harold stopped a few feet from Wolf. Behind him stood Admiral Richardson, now a powerful military leader but once a young recruit who had learned everything he knew from Instructor Thompson. Next to him was Commander Martinez, who had become a legendary SEAL team leader using the techniques Harold had taught him. "Son," Harold said to Wolf, his voice clear and commanding, "that cap you're treating like a toy. I'd earned it training men who became heroes. Men who are now standing behind me." The Admiral stepped forward. "That's not just any veteran you've been disrespecting," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "This is Master Chief Instructor Thompson, the man who taught me and everyone here how to be not just soldiers, but men of honor." Wolf looked around, suddenly realizing he was surrounded by some of the most elite military personnel in the country. His gang members began backing away, their usual bravado completely gone. "Sir," Wolf stammered, quickly grabbing Harold's cap from his motorcycle, "I didn't know." But Harold raised his hand, stopping Wolf mid-sentence. The old veteran's eyes weren't angry. They were filled with something else, disappointment and wisdom. "Young man," Harold said, "you don't need to fear these men behind me. They're not here for revenge. They're here to show you what real brotherhood looks like, what respect truly means." The bikers stood frozen as more military vehicles arrived. Marine Corps officers, Navy commanders, and active duty SEALs continued to gather, forming a circle around the diner. Each of them had a story about how Harold Thompson had changed their lives, had taught them not just about fighting, but about honor, dignity, and real strength. Pete opened the diner's door wide, and the morning sun broke through the fog, shining on the medals adorning Harold's uniform. The moment had come for everyone in Millbrook to learn who Harold Thompson really was, and more importantly, to teach some young bikers a lesson they would never forget. The scene at Pete's diner that morning was unlike anything Millbrook had ever seen. As Harold Thompson stood in his decorated uniform, surrounded by elite military personnel, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The bikers, including their leader Wolf, remained unusually quiet. Admiral Richardson stepped forward, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Pete," he called out to the diner owner, "I believe we'll all be having breakfast this morning. Some of us have traveled quite far to share a meal with our old instructor." Pete, still amazed by the scene unfolding in front of his diner, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, coming right up." The sight was extraordinary. Navy SEALs in their dress uniforms, Marine commanders, and other high-ranking officers began filing into the small diner. Sarah, the waitress, watched in awe as these powerful military leaders treated Harold with incredible respect, each one stopping to salute him before entering. "Master Chief Thompson," a tall commander said, "I brought something for you." He held out a small wooden box. Inside was a rare Navy Cross medal, one of the highest honors in the military. "You earned this back in '62, but you were too humble to ever wear it. We think it's time everyone knew." Harold accepted the box quietly, his eyes showing emotion he rarely displayed. The bikers watched this exchange with growing understanding and shame on their faces. "Would you like to join us for breakfast?" Harold suddenly asked Wolf and his gang, surprising everyone. "There are some stories you might want to hear." Wolf, who had been holding Harold's cap nervously, stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice different from his usual mocking tone, "I believe this belongs to you." He handed the cap back with trembling hands. Inside the diner, every table was filled with a mix of military personnel and bikers. Sarah rushed around with coffee pots, listening in amazement as the officers shared stories about Harold's teaching days. "You see that move you bikers use to kickstart your motorcycles?" one SEAL commander said to the gang members. "Harold here taught us a similar technique for underwater combat. Saved my life twice in Operation Desert Storm." Another officer spoke up. "Remember the time you made us swim 5 miles in freezing water, Master Chief?" he asked Harold. "We thought you were being tough on us, but that training helped my entire team survive a mission gone wrong in '85. Wolf and his gang sat quietly, their faces showing a mix of embarrassment and growing respect. They learned how Harold had not only trained elite forces, but had also developed combat techniques still used by special forces today. "Sir," Wolf finally spoke up, addressing Harold, "I had no idea. My father was a Marine, and he used to tell me about a legendary instructor who changed his life. Could it have been?" Harold nodded slowly. "What was your father's name, son?" "James Morrison, sir. He served in the late '70s. Harold's eyes lit up with recognition. "Ah, Jimmy Morrison, tough as nails, but always helped the struggling recruits. He was one of my best students." Wolf's face changed completely. Tears formed in his eyes as he realized he had been bullying the very man his late father had respected most. The breakfast continued for hours, the diner filled with stories of bravery, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Harold's former students shared tales of how his teachings had shaped not just their military careers but their entire lives. Pete had to call in extra help to handle all the customers. The scene was remarkable. tough-looking bikers sitting shoulder to shoulder with decorated military officers, all listening intently to Harold's wisdom. The strongest person in the room, Harold said to everyone gathered, isn't always the loudest or the most intimidating. True strength comes from how you treat others, especially those who can't defend themselves. Sarah watched as Wolf and his gang members nodded in agreement, their previous arrogance replaced by genuine respect and attention. The transformation was remarkable. As the morning went on, something unexpected began to happen. The barrier between the bikers and the military men started to fade. They found common ground in their stories of service, brotherhood, and the search for purpose in civilian life. What had started as a tense confrontation was turning into something nobody had expected. The beginning of understanding and respect between two very different groups of people, all thanks to a 93-year-old veteran who had chosen to respond to bullying not with anger, but with wisdom. A week had passed since the remarkable morning at Pete's Diner. The town of Millbrook had completely changed. The story of Harold Thompson, the legendary Navy SEAL instructor, had spread throughout the community, turning him into a local hero. But the biggest change was seen in Wolf's motorcycle gang. On this particular morning, Harold arrived at the diner to find something unexpected. The bikers were there, but instead of blocking his path, they had cleared a special parking spot just for him. A handmade sign read, "Reserved for Master Chief Thompson." Wolf stepped forward to greet Harold, no longer wearing his intimidating leather jacket. Instead, he wore a clean button-up shirt with a small pin on the collar, his father's Marine Corps emblem. "Master Chief Thompson," Wolf said respectfully, "we've been doing some thinking this past week. My father's old military journal. I found it in our attic." He pulled out a worn notebook. "There are pages and pages about you in here." Inside the diner, Sarah was setting up a special table. The bikers had pushed several tables together, creating one long space where they could all sit together. The walls of the diner had changed too. Pete had created a special corner dedicated to Harold's service, displaying photographs that the military officers had shared. As Harold sat down, Wolf opened his father's journal and began to read. April 15, 1978. Today, Instructor Thompson taught us more than just survival techniques. He showed us what it means to be a real leader. When Martinez couldn't complete the underwater training, instead of kicking him out, Thompson spent extra hours helping him. That's the kind of man I want to become. Tears formed in Wolf's eyes as he read his late father's words. The other bikers listened quietly, many of them veterans themselves who had lost their way after leaving the service. "Sir," Wolf continued, his voice shaking slightly, "my father passed away 5 years ago. Reading his journal, I realized I've dishonored everything he believed in. Everything you taught him." The other gang members nodded in agreement. One of them, a younger biker named Tommy, spoke up. "We all served," he said. "Different branches, different times. But we came home feeling lost. We thought being tough and scary would make us feel strong again." Harold listened carefully, sipping his morning coffee, which now appeared at his table exactly the way he liked it, served by the same bikers who had once mocked him. "The way you handled us, sir," another biker added, "not with force, but with dignity. It reminded us of what real military leadership looks like." Sarah watched from behind the counter as more revelations came out. Many of the bikers shared their own stories of military service, stories they had buried beneath their rough exteriors. Some had served in Iraq, others in Afghanistan. Each one carried memories they had tried to forget by creating this tough guy image. Pete emerged from the kitchen with a special breakfast. He had prepared military-style hash browns and eggs, a tribute to Harold's service days. The bikers had specially requested it, wanting to experience a taste of the military life they had once known. "Master Chief," Wolf said, standing up straight, "we have a proposition for you. Our motorcycle club. We want to change its purpose. Instead of causing trouble, we want to support veterans in the community. Would you? Would you consider being our advisor?" The other bikers straightened up in their seats, looking at Harold hopefully. These were no longer the intimidating troublemakers of a week ago. They were men searching for the structure, purpose, and brotherhood they had lost after leaving the service. Harold looked around the table at each face. He saw beyond their tough exteriors to the soldiers they had once been and could be again. In their eyes, he recognized the same look he had seen in thousands of young recruits over his years of training, the desire to be part of something meaningful. Boys, Harold said, his voice carrying the same authority that had guided countless seals. Sometimes the biggest act of courage is admitting when you've been wrong and choosing to change course. The diner fell silent, everyone waiting for Harold's answer to their proposal. What they didn't know was that Harold had already seen this transformation coming. After all, he hadn't spent decades training America's elite forces without learning to see the potential in even the most challenging recruits. 6 months had passed since that memorable morning at Pete's Diner when Harold Thompson faced down a gang of bikers with an army of elite military personnel. The scene at the diner today was completely different from what it had been half a year ago. The motorcycle club, once known for causing trouble, had transformed into the Veterans' Guardian Angels, with Harold serving as their honorary leader and mentor. Their leather jackets now displayed a new patch, an angel's wing combined with military dog tags, designed with Harold's guidance. On this bright morning, Pete's Diner was hosting a special breakfast event. The parking lot was filled with motorcycles, but they were neatly arranged, leaving plenty of space for other customers. Wolf, wearing his Reform Club's new jacket, stood at the door greeting veterans who came in. "Welcome to our monthly Veterans Breakfast," he would say with a warm smile. "First meal is on us for any service member." Inside, the diner had become a gathering place for veterans from all around the county. The walls were now covered with military photographs, including a special section dedicated to Harold's teaching years. The bikers had helped create this memorial, carefully framing and hanging each picture. Sarah, still working as a waitress, couldn't help but smile at the changes. Instead of intimidating customers, the former troublemakers now helped elderly veterans from their cars to their seats. They listened respectfully to war stories and offered support to younger veterans struggling with civilian life. "Master Chief," Wolf called out as Harold entered the diner. "We got great news. The veteran housing project we discussed. The city council approved it this morning." The club had been working for months on a project to convert an old building into affordable housing for homeless veterans. It was Harold's idea, but the bikers had done all the hard work, attending council meetings, organizing fundraisers, and volunteering their time for renovation work. Tommy, the youngest member of the club, rushed up to Harold with excitement. "Sir, remember that Vietnam veteran we found living under the bridge last month? He moved into his new apartment yesterday. Even found him a job at the local garage." Harold sat at his usual table, now marked with a small brass plaque reading, "Master Chief Thompson's Table." The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the medals and commendations that now decorated the diner's walls. Pete emerged from the kitchen with a special breakfast platter. "The usual, Master Chief," he said proudly. "And wait till you hear about what your boys did yesterday." The boys, as everyone now called the former gang members, had spent the previous day helping a widow of a World War II veteran repair her roof. They had also established a regular program to help military families with home repairs and maintenance. "You know, sir," Wolf said, sitting down across from Harold, "my father would be proud of what we've become." In his journal, he wrote about how you always said that true strength is measured by how we help others. The diner was now full of life and positive energy. Every Sunday, the club organized motorcycle rides to raise funds for veteran causes. They had become known throughout the state for their work with PTSD support groups and their dedication to helping military families in need. Harold looked around at the scene before him. The once rowdy bikers were now respected community leaders. They had found purpose in serving others, just as they had done in their military days. Their tough exterior remained, but it now protected those who needed help rather than intimidating the weak. "Master Chief," a young veteran called from across the diner, "the nightmares I told you about. They're getting better since I joined the support group. Thank you for showing these guys how to help people like me." As Harold enjoyed his breakfast, surrounded by the positive changes he had helped create, he remembered that morning 6 months ago when he had made the choice to respond to bullying with wisdom rather than anger. That decision had not only transformed a group of lost souls, but had also created a support system for veterans that was changing lives every day. Sarah refilled Harold's coffee cup and whispered, "Mr. Thompson, who would have thought that those scary bikers would become Millbrook's guardian angels?" Harold smiled, watching as his boys continued their morning routine of serving others. Sometimes, he replied softly, "The people who seem the most lost are just waiting for someone to show them the way home." The morning sun continued to shine through Pete Steiner's windows, illuminating not just the medals and photographs on the walls, but also the faces of men who had found their true purpose, not in intimidation and fear, but in service and brotherhood, just as their mentor had taught them so many years ago.